So on my template in Cubase for my orchestra, this is pretty much what allows me to work fairly quickly. So if you look at it, I'm just going to close all the folders. So I've created a bunch of folders for each contact multi that I have set up. So I have 64 contact multis, right? And they're all set up to house what I call my favorite sample patches from all the libraries that I have. And just to give you an example, so I've got two contact instances to cover all my Berlin flutes and all the patches here. So you can see how flute 1 multi-A is on MIDI channel 1. The next one down would be MIDI channel 2, etc. So in this multi goes to, I got a flute 3 channel 14, so 14 MIDI channels on that multi. And there, I've got it set up within the multis. I'll show it to you with like a cello multi because I've got that loaded already. But I've got it set up where I do this for every patch in the whole orchestral family. So there's my flutes. So this is, I also have the Spitfire libraries. So my symphonic woodwinds, I have that all set up. And a multi, and then cinesamples and things like that. So I have, everything kind of set up, and I have it color coded in a way that makes sense for me. So there's, and I go in orchestral order in my template, and that's just the way it feels comfortable for me because it's as if I'm working up and from top to bottom in a score. As I'm programming the stuff that I write out. So oboes, same deal. We got an A and a B. Multi for the oboes for the Berlin library. I put the bassoons. It's not necessarily a score order here, but I just put the double reeds together because of the way I set up my templates. I'm kind of utilizing I think my oboes and bassoons together because to me the color of the oboes and the bassoons being double reed instruments is a brighter color, so I tend to in the mixing process I combine them together, and then the flutes and the clarinets I may combine them together. So it's just something in how I approach the mixing. Then I got my clarinets. All right, so you can see all sorts of clarinet 1, clarinet 2, E flat, clarinet, bass clarinets, ensemble stuff, SFX, things like that. The B clarinets is a solo clarinet. Spitfire, woodwinds, and then the cage woodwinds from ADIO. Alright, so there's my woodwinds, I've got my French horns, I've got my trumpets. They're all here, and including all my, the Berlin library has a couple of newer patches in one of the newer libraries this year with different kinds of mutes. It's not complete. I don't think I've found a sample library collection that actually has what I could use in the real world because there's just so many mute color choices that are available with real players, and I don't have any sample libraries that I've seen that really have a complete set of all the mutes because you're talking there's no cup mutes here, which is a mute set that I tend to use a lot with my trumpets and my trombones. There's fiber mutes and bucket mutes are similar to fiber mutes and things like that. So so we got the typical straight mutes, harmon mutes, but we don't have cups. And there's just a bunch of others. Plungers, I will use plungers. So there's trumpets, trombones, low brass, bass trombone, tuba samples, things like that. And then my percussion, so my percussion is split up in different kinds of multis. So I've got a timpani multi, which is just timpani, and that allows me to control just the timpani in my mixes. And then I also have my mallet instruments as a separate multi. So things like marimba, xylophone, vibraphones, glockenspiel, and I even have my boobams in here in the mallets because I think of them more like a mallet instrument. and then my battery is in a bunch of different multis. So in this, the way I've laid it out right here, I've got like 5 different battery multis, and I'm just going to open them up. So battery A is like all my bass drums, my concert toms, snares, um, tenor drums, things like that. And then battery B is the piatti, all the suspended cymbals, tam-tams. Yeah, so you can see how I'm organizing things. Battery C, we start getting into more of the toys, like tambourines, triangles, rototoms, things I don't use quite as often. Temple blocks, wood blocks, anvils, brake drums, thunder sheets, bell tree, all that kind of stuff. Battery D, more toys. So rainmaker, chimes, bamboo chimes, seashell trees, finger cymbals, all that kind of stuff. And then battery E is more my Afro-Cuban kinds of stuff. So congas, bongos, timbales, cowbells, claves, castanets, huiro, shakers, things like that. So I put that as a separate thing because there's sometimes I might do a cue that has things like more the Afro-Cuban and Brazilian percussion kinds of things. Um, so that's percussion, and then I have other libraries like Spitfire, True Strike, DIO, that kind of thing. My harp is actually a bunch of different libraries, even though I marked the folder as the Berlin harp. So I've got a bunch of the Berlin patches, but I also have the Cine harp and the Project Sam concert harp, which is an older harp, just so I have some harp choices. Or if I want to write for multiple harps, I may use one of those other harps for something like that. Under my keyboards, I have my piano, and I tend to like this Imperfect Steinway, which is a British sample library developer. But also, I've got Celestin here, and then some prepared piano and piano effects and things like that. So that's all under my keyboards. My choir, I've got everything separated by the actual library. So my Voxos stuff is all together. Requiem, right? And these are like 4 Voxos, Requiem, Liberis, and Storm Choir too. So like all my choirs, I've got as separate. Each of these folders represents a separate contact instance, so that they're separate as well. Otherwise, you get too many MIDI notes triggering on things like that, and it tends to clog up your performance. Okay, and then we get into our strings, and it's similar format. So, violins. I have a violin 1A and B, so long bows, short bows, dynamics, and I'll get into the multis once I get to the cello. So it's set like that: violins 1, 2, violis, celli, contrabasses, right? And then I have ensemble stuff, like the whole string section, things like that. So if I go to my celli A, and then this should be loaded by now. So you can see how so I've got my outputs all set up. I'm just going to mute the viewing the outputs button. So so here's a Berlin typical celli, and these are my own custom setups. They're not the default Berlin patches. So I kind of set them up the way I like it, and then I'll get into expression maps in a little bit. But everything's set up the way I like it, and what feels like the most logical and comfortable for me. And then I've got everything routed. When I have my this is my full version. I have 2 different kinds of multis they're sort of duplicates. One is the full version where I have access to any mics that I want in my mixes. So the surrounds, the tree, the AB mics for the wide spread, close-up mics if I want more definition, and then I have a light version which is just the tree, and that's so that if I'm working and setting up a demo to play for a client, then I start with just the light version of the tree because it loads faster, obviously, and allows me to work a little quicker. And then when it comes time to doing rendering a mix, then I'll load up the full version. And since the template's exactly the same and everything's already pre-routed in my buses, then it just makes it a lot easier for me to work and render stuff out. Okay, so everything's routed there, and then I would just go back to my typical display. So you can see, and everything is all set up, as far as MIDI channel assignments and all that. So it's, it's pretty easy to do, especially like, once I set up a particular multi within Berlin or a patch within Berlin, all I have to do is just save it. So I just like save as, and then I'll save as is for the patch. Save multi is to save the whole multi. So you don't have to save individual patches. You can just create the multi. But I like to also create my own custom patches that are my preferred go-to patches, and then once I get them the way I like it, I'm in good shape, because I can also adjust things like the I rarely adjust the panning, because usually a lot of these libraries, the panning seems like it's in a pretty good spot compared to where the Deca-tree is and all that, but it could be that certain sounds are a little louder than others, and I've noticed that I think they fixed it in a recent update with the percussion in Berlin Library, but I was noticing some of my bass drum patches were just blowing out and just crapping out my distorting basically the output. So I'd hit like a 127 velocity, and I would just see it go into the red, which is, to me, it's just a lack of rigor on the part of the sample library designer to just make sure all that stuff doesn't happen. And the other thing that happens, it's a common thing, and it's not just blaming the orchestral tools guys, because I've seen it with just about every library. When you have, let's say it's a cello section short marcato kind of or a staccato kind of a patch. If you're trying to do something that, if it's polyphonic, if it's a section sound, then every time, if you're playing a 3-part chord, you're actually tripling your room sound, and you're tripling the amount of audio volume than if it's just one line. So one of the mistakes that sample library developers sometimes make is they don't consider that in their volume level. So it might be better to set your general volume on a patch for -6 dB, so that when you are actually doing a 3 or 4-part chord on your in your sequencing on that same patch, the volume level actually stays below the distortion threshold. So it's just trying to find a balance with all of that. So sometimes I just make small adjustments. For the most part, like the Berlin library, I've noticed, and a lot of the libraries, for the most part, most of the patches are fine. Occasionally you get something a little weird where, let's say, your sustained long volume is at a pretty good decibel level, but then you go to your shorts and actually is like unnaturally louder than it would sound acoustically. So then I make adjustments so that it sounds acoustically correct. So, that's sort of most of the things I can think about as far as how I think about setting up my templates. The idea is that I can basically have a good starting point for my mixes right from the get-go. It's just and then I just make smaller adjustments as I go. It allows me to move really quickly in my writing process. I can put my demos together, and there's a generally decent enough mix to get started with to send it to a client without me having to do too much or adjust too many things on an individual cue, because the key is to be really efficient with your time, and that's the whole idea of a template.